Whether your game takes place at your house, a friend's, or online, it's important to keep your behavior in check. No one wants their game night to be ruined because someone at the table has no manners. Maybe there are constant interruptions, or half the table keeps staring at their phones. As a game master, the attention of your players is split. As a player, you can't roleplay with the other party members who aren't keeping focus. It is a frustrating phenomenon that we've all encountered, and this type of encounter can't be won through combat, but through courtesy. How can you conduct yourself as a player or game master at the game table? What can you do if your party becomes unruly? Starblade covers the basics of etiquette for GMs and players alike tonight on Playing God. I'm your host, Nick Logie, and with me as always is Xander. Let me run on the ceiling, Nolan.
Hey, man.
Let's start from the GM point of view. Why is it important to set clear expectations in regards to etiquette?
Well, my goal as a game master is to provide a healthy, safe, and a fun gaming experience. If at any point in time players become uncomfortable or problems arise because of gameplay, other players, DM issues, I readily invite my players and expect them to bring these things to my attention as their game master. I want my players to feel respected and their voice to be heard within our community so that we can all have a better experience together. The content of games can get graphic from time to time, and there can be points where things might make players feel uncomfortable with racism, sexism, and things of that nature, both in play and out of play, which is unfortunate but true. And that expectation is for everyone to be forthcoming if problems are caused. And the reason why is if you have a healthy gaming experience, you're more likely to continue wanting to play and you're more likely to maintain that friendship with other players. But during gameplay, if there becomes an unhealthy environment, either in play or out of play, it dissuades your players from wanting to play. They dread going to Monday night game rather than being excited, so they don't get into their characters as much and they don't want to be a part of it. My personal opinion is that I want to do everything I can to keep that from happening. So I insist on proper game etiquette, and I spell these things out in a rather detailed player's handbook for the campaign specifically.
So what
And
you're
I
getting
feel like
at,
it
and
helps.
what we're trying, and what is the important part to take away from all this is that the whole point of setting expectations about etiquette before you start your game is to prevent all the problems from occurring later on if you don't do it. So
Precisely.
if you don't make it clear that either we're not going to bring this stuff up at the table, or you can't do this at the table, or try not to do this, then if that's not set at the beginning of the game or whenever the player joins the party, if they happen to be coming in at a later time in the campaign, then later on down the road, you're going to see people doing something that you don't like, whether that's either constantly looking at the rule book for various things, either during their turn or not, whether it's like fiddling around with shit at the table, constant like chip eating with like open mouth, crunching and all that. Whatever it is,
Ugh.
there's going to be something that you realize that you should have brought up that it's
Hmm.
just irritating you the more and more it happens. And
Yes.
a lot of times I've seen this fester in GMs as less of a thing that they try to solve later and more like a way to get back at the players post-mortem.
Yeah.
And you want to avoid doing that because the player doesn't know why you're fucking like dogging them all of a sudden unless you've
Yeah.
said, hey, stop opening up every bag of Doritos on the planet every time we're at the game table.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this document that you brought up, Xander.
Okay.
The thing
Um,
what you said right at the beginning of the podcast, so you read that was like a verbatim thing that from your own document, your 25
exactly.
page document that you give to every player, right?
Yeah, that is indeed correct. Um, this document, in my opinion, is one of the most important things that you can write up for your character for your gaming. Before you go through the process of actually doing the character creation and making sure that your players are on board with this is you write up this document. It doesn't have to be 25 pages. I'm just extra.
Well, to be
Uh,
fair, only like two of these like one and a half of these pages is your actual etiquette section. The rest of it is everything else about your goddamn game that takes
yeah,
25 pages.
yeah. It's religion, agriculture, economy, character backgrounds, limitations for your playable races, playable classes, alignments, everything. I put everything in one document, and the reason why is upon starting the game, my expectation is that my players have all read through this in its entirety. They know the setting, they know my expectations, and they know what they can expect from me. Because of that, if a player starts to do things that is clearly spelled out within, the game etiquette, or they want to try and run a character that's not within the guidelines, I can be like, hey, look, you're supposed to have read this. And if I present them with a sort of not really a signed, but a sort of syllabus-like contract that the expectations are already there, they're already presented, and they can figure out whether or not A, they want to be even a part of the game, because this is where you spell out everything that you will expect from them. If they're wanting a hack and slash, but you're wanting to do a completely different kind of game, they'll know it. It's not a sit down, discuss it. It's a, this is what's going to happen. Are you cool with this? If yes, you don't have to sign on the dotted line. There's no dotted line, but this is a sort of verbal contract that you make with your players, and making that is really important. A really good example is I have a certain maturity requirement for my players. Uh, Inappropriate jokes, harassment, racism, sexism, cultural insensitivity will not be tolerated, like at all, even from me, but straight up. And so making offhanded comments
Oh, by
about
the
the
way,
way,
real quick, that's a real important point. Whatever you expect your players to do, you need to expect yourself to do.
oh
Likewise,
yes,
if you're a player
absolutely,
at the table, whatever your GM expects you to do, should also respect their own goddamn rules
hmm
and like listen to whatever it is. So
yeah,
that was a little sidebar, but please continue.
yeah. Um, the first bullet point that I have under player expectations is because I expect that maturity. The first bullet point states, chaotic stupid is not an alignment. Please act like a person. I know it's hard, but I have to, so do you. That basically spells out in a couple of sentences that I expect you to come to this game table with a certain level of maturity and a certain level of respect for the fact that I'm putting in a lot of work to make this game for you guys as my players, but I'm also championing people that may not always get the spotlight. They always play the underhanded role, and they've kind of been typecast as a certain kind of character. And I like to think that my games offer a certain environment where you can expand yourself, not with just your character types, but also your role playing types. And one of the things that will drop a game super fast is something that I like to call chaotic stupid. I'm not sure who coined it, but the barbarian walks into the middle of the room, and the guy on the other side of the counter is like, "Hello, excuse me. I seem to be having some trouble. I'm gonna kill him." Wait, what? I'm gonna chop his head off right now. That's not how a person would react. But you see that time and time again with inexperienced players, people that want a certain game feel, coming to a more serious game. And because I spell that out in my expectations, they know that that's not acceptable. A couple of times a game, hey, if it creates a funny moment or interesting story, I might let it slide, but you have to be at least a decent player on the surface before I can expect you to make some more foolish decisions and kind of run with them. There's a
So
big
that's that.
difference.
So something that a lot of GMs do, and I do this depending on the system, but generally I stay away from it. Is the ability to basically unlock the ability to play more special characters. So let's use let's just use Dungeons and Dragons as an example. So when I say more specialized character, I'm talking about before you can pick anything from the Sword Coast Adventures guide, I need to see you playing a basic class and race within the setting, so I know that you can handle like the complexity that would come from more specialized character, and that if I give you some big responsibility with this whatever character you play, it's not going to become trash. It's not going to get so out of hand or off the rails that I don't even really want to give you anything special anymore. Some GMs do
Yeah.
that, and like I said, I usually do it based on the system. Shadowrun's one of the systems I do that for because that game's complicated enough as just I want to be a dude who sits in the van and shoots a gun. Then
Yeah, that's super complex.
even
Trying
that is
to
hard enough. So if you want to play a
yeah.
freaking technomancer who's playing I don't know, like a vampire technomancer in uh, who works for Ass Technology or something crazy like that, then you don't get to do that right out of the gate. If you tell me a cool character concept, that's awesome and all, but I need to make sure you can actually handle that character concept within the realm of the setting.
Yeah.
And you could lay that kind of thing out in whatever if you even have an etiquette document. Some
Yes.
I usually take a more looser approach where I don't bullet point it out, but I do let everyone know exactly what kind of game that they're getting into. Uh, and I like your second point here. I'm looking at Xander's notes for this, and it's about alcohol consumption, and
Yes.
it's about not going overboard. That is a good rule to have. If
Hmm.
you're if especially if you're doing a beer and pretzels kind of game, and you just want to sit down and hit some stuff or whatever, then even if you're just kind of going nuts with it, getting completely intoxicated is going to ruin the game. Even unless if you're all so drunk you can't remember the game, then I guess you could go with that. But that's probably not a good way to do it. So I like this point about what you have here.
Yeah.
Personally, for my games, that's never actually been an issue. Now that I'm
Hmm.
thinking about it, I don't know if anybody's ever drunk anything at my game.
I've drank a couple of times where I'd have a couple of beers while I'm sitting there playing, but because I have this in mind, I also adhere to the same rules as a player for other people's campaigns, simply because it's the respectful thing to do, and especially when other people are involved who are not drinking.
See, I
And
didn't even notice. I didn't even notice you ever did that,
yeah,
and
see, that's the thing.
that's
That's
because
how
you
you know.
weren't doing vodka shots after each D20 roll.
Yeah. Now, that said, one of the caveats to that is that the expectation of what drunk is different for every person. If you can do a shot every 45 minutes and be perfectly coherent and fine, then cool. I mean, that's badass, but that's fine. As long as you keep it to a buzz stage where you're not getting so trashed that you're like, I'm gonna is there a hooker here in this
Could
bar? As I want to screw a hooker tonight. Like, don't go nuts.
I
If you
have
keep it
Mountain
under
Dew?
control. Hey, 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 look. Yes, I ask, but that's because I'm also being respectful. Damn it, Nick. A little bit of backstory for you guys listening. While I was living in Savannah and playing in Nick's Shadowrun campaign, I would help from time to time provide like the sodas and things like that, but sometimes I did not. And my thing is always, hey, can I X? Can I Y? Let the DM know, let the people who own the house and have paid for these things know that you want to partake of. Don't go nuts, but I mean, I'll get up and I'll go to the fridge. I'll say, hey, can I have a Mountain Dew? And Nick's like, dude, fucking just take one. And I'm like,
Yeah, definitely. If you're at my table, you could. I don't care. You could just drink and eat whatever I have out. I was actually not referencing that though, Xander. I was referencing an
oh really?
old 8-bit theater video from like the early days of YouTube and Newgrounds, where
Oh
it's
wow.
It's a D&D game. But I mean, that's where you get the classic lines of, I want to attack the darkness.
Oh
And
yeah, that's right.
if there's like, I think it was like, if there's any barmaids there, I want to do them.
Yeah. So I didn't get the reference. Congratulations, Internet. You found my weakness. Um,
Critical hit to Xander's pride.
yeah. Ah, no. Um, to jump back onto the train of thought, so to speak. Um, some of the things I'll go through briefly that I add to my document are some of the lesser known problems that you uncover as a GM just as time goes on.
And after you
Uh,
list these, I want to give some more common examples of something that I usually see in games that I'm not running, like I'm a player in.
mhm.
These are much more common examples that, in case you're struggling with even like some basic things, I still want to go over with it. But please
Yeah.
go ahead.
One is if you're a player, know your class. Just know what you're supposed to be doing. Be planning out what you're going to be doing before your turn comes around. Know your spells. Try to keep sidebar conversations to a minimum. Don't be checking your phone. And my take on GM rulings that they'll be maintained throughout the given session, and the rules for that have specific guidelines. Like, is this ruling going to cause the imminent death of a character? If yes, we'll discuss it right now. If no, we'll keep going and we'll discuss it in the after action review of the game. And things like stomping over other players, not letting the players have the limelight, and just general paying attention, taking notes, and things like that.
So you're
It's
actually
not
you're kind of
super
glossing
heavy.
over a lot, like some pretty complicated subjects. I gotta say. So let's take that back a little bit. Let's start with just like the phone situation, because
Okay.
that's a common one that everyone's got to deal with because everybody's got a
Oh
phone.
yeah.
And
Yep.
so some tables just rule no phones at the table. We're here for like 3 or however many hours we're sitting here for. We're here to play a game and hang out with our friends. So just don't have it. That's a little extreme for me. Um,
Yeah.
I don't have a hard ruling on phones myself. I basically just kind of feel for it. It's like if you are on your phone every fucking second that I'm not directly speaking to you, then that's a problem. If you're like
Yeah.
checking the time every I don't know, every half hour, so you're just like clicking on the phone, looking for notifications or something, or like even do some quick browsing. Like as long as
Hmm.
it's not frequent, just whatever, and as long as it
Yeah.
doesn't impact the game. That's kind of the big thing that you with the playing your moves ahead of time. We've all been at the table where we're sitting there, and it gets to we'll say the wizard's turn because the wizard has a lot of spells and a lot of stuff to do. And it gets to the wizard's
Yeah.
turn, and he's like, I don't know what to do. So he pulls out the book, whatever the rule book is, the fucking huge tome, slaps that biddy over to the spell list, and has to start reading the mechanics for his own class. And as he does this, time ticks away. The table becomes more and more distracted. And then when the wizard finally goes, then it takes the turn, and then immediately goes back to not paying attention. That has a lot of huge problems in it just right there.
Yeah.
So, how do we handle just even something simple as distractions?
Well, a good means by which to handle distractions around a game table is to provide. Now this is going to sound kind of strange, but something that I've learned over time is if there is some kind of external acoustic thing happening, like there's the water droplets and the general echo to a cave that you guys are exploring through. It helps add to atmosphere, but that adding to the atmosphere for like a big battle, there's like cool music and stuff like that. It helps push your player into their role as their character, and the more you can offer some kind of external thing to get them more into character, by proxy, things like distraction goes down. It's one of the reasons why I will always advocate having music and stuff like that playing because it helps stop sidebars from happening. So that's actually a really good tool for
You take a lead by
that
example approach for this. I see.
precisely.
So let's talk about some specific instances. One thing that you cannot stop if you have what I'm about to list in your house. You need to extricate it from the room for the duration of the night. Is any pets? If you have a cat walking around, if you have a dog in there, if you have a bird, whatever it is, if you have a pet and it's visible to the players, they're distracted. Doesn't matter who it is, doesn't matter what iron willpower they all have. If that cat comes by, someone's going to reach down and pet it.
Yep.
And that cat or dog may want all the attention in the world, and it will receive it so long as you cannot command the table. So you may want to just take your pet, put it in maybe another room if you can do that, or at the very least, if if it's gonna roam around and there's nothing you can do about it for one reason or another, then you got to straight up just say like, don't pay attention to the cat, like don't pet the cat.
Yeah.
Then
Uh,
and you need to have that conversation with your players. See, what I'm getting at is, Xander, you have a more indirect approach, and some of the problems that I've encountered as a GM and as a player require direct action. Like
oh yeah.
not even like a group, hey, we need to do this, but you name, I need to talk to you right now. And
Yeah.
then you get up and go discuss what needs to happen. I've only had to do that I think one time, and that was for a really dire circumstance where someone
Hmm.
was causing so much disruption at the table that no other people who were trying to talk to me couldn't hear what I was saying, and I couldn't hear what they were responding to because this person was being very loud and boisterous and just not giving a damn about the game. And that's when I had to be like, all right, dude, hold on a minute, come with me. And then I had to talk to him for a minute. Now, you don't need to fucking come down like the goddamn adamantium hammer on top of a CR 1/8 goblin. You don't need to do that. You just need to be like, look, this is what's going on.
Hmm.
Something needs to change. How can we?
Yep.
What can either we do? What can I do? What could you do to make the game more engaging for you to pay attention to? And in the worst situation, because we have to cover this, Sandra. I know you want to say something, but if nothing can change, if this person does not like even attempt to like either course correct or make a concerted effort to get more engaged in the game and to make sure that the other players at the table are also equally engaged, you might need to just straight up kick them out of the game.
Yeah. That is a worst case scenario,
But it is a
but
scenario that it is
it
possible to
can
come
happen.
to.
Yes. And as a GM, from personal experience, I know these people are likely your friends. They're people that you work with, you go to school with, they're your friends, your colleagues. You
People you
spend
live
time with them.
with, in some cases.
People you live with, in some cases, in more cases often uh, than you know. Uh, Having to take that as a GM's role is probably one of the hardest things that you have to do. But I can tell you from personal experience that if you don't draw those lines in the sand and you don't make it absolutely clear that these are your expectations and you don't take that moment to step up and say, hey, can I talk to you for a second? You don't have to be mean or
Yeah, we
problematic
talked
with
about
the
the hammer.
person, but
The hammer's
you
my
have
dick.
to you God, you have to be able to reach down into yourself and recognize that as a GM, part of that is your responsibility. Your responsibility to that is for your other players, for your campaign that you've sweated and aggravated, like, killed yourself trying to create. That creation and the other players putting that forward is what you are defending in that moment. And this other player, regardless of who they are, is directly disrespecting that. Now they may not be aware of it,
But yeah,
but if
that's
it
why you talk to them. That's why you
yeah,
don't yell at them. You just have a conversation.
but sometimes a player may not be right for your setting, and you might not know this in the very beginning,
But
and it's not something
that is
you have to
why
feel out.
I always harp on the setting the expectations thing. Like pretty much every
Yes.
episode, I'll bring it up because it's it's not about just like trying to optimize for fun, but a lot of it's so that way you could just not have to worry about dealing with the hard stuff because the hard stuff just doesn't show up. If you have set clear expectations, someone comes to the table, they know what they're here for, you know what they're here for, and you don't have to worry about later on down the line when they're trying to play a game that you're not running.
Yeah, and being aware of that as both a GM and where your players are sitting is really important. Now, there's something else from the GM side. This I have this in my notes as well. As a GM, I'm human. I make mistakes. The DM for your game is probably going to know a lot about your setting because they made it, and a lot about the system that they're running because that's part of your responsibility as a GM. But there's nobody that I've ever met, no GM, not Matt Mercer, not me, not Nick, not Jesse, not nobody that we've ever played with has the book completely memorized. Being that guy and interrupting the flow of game to point on a game mechanic mistake, like the bullets clearly say this and da 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 da. That shit is really bad. It's one of those things that can take a DM from, all right, I'm in a good flow, I'm doing okay, and then a nasally voice from the right side of you on the other side of the table just pipes up with, well, doesn't it actually do this? You're done. Like, it's going to be
So,
hard for you to get back into that
so
flow.
Xander, I actually have to disagree with you on this point, which is very interesting because we look at this in very different ways. So you
Yeah,
imagine a nasally voiced guy going, actually. And yes, if it is a constant interruption, then it could be a pain in the ass. But more
yeah,
often than not, I do want someone like that at my table. Sometimes I am that person at the table. Because
yeah,
sometimes you need to have somebody who might, because if the GM doesn't know all the rules, somebody who does know all the rules, like, it could be very relevant to what's going on. And then you don't have to look it up either. Uh, or if this person says it really should be playing out like this, like more of a suggestion, and they usually know exactly where in the book to turn to also. So you just be like, bam, page 178 right here. It's like, this is important for what's going on. Maybe it's not critical for what's going on, but I feel like if your flow is broken as a GM by somebody asking a rules question, even in the middle of like whatever you're doing, then you need to be able to adapt better as a storyteller. Because
yes,
let's take this guy out of the equation. You still have four people who are in character, also still asking you questions, also still trying to do stuff for their character, and also
yeah.
needing to know the rules, and might not know them down to a T, like actually McFedora Face is.
Yeah. Um, the way that I covered that specific thing is the way my flow as a GM works is fairly tentative, and I'm still working on it. I am by no means infallible as a GM. I will make a lot of mistakes, I promise you. Um, the thing that I have spelled out is if there's an encounter during a session where there's a disagreement on a ruling, uh, I will make a call. And Nick, I've seen you do this a couple of times regarding like stun damage and stuff like that. It's not necessarily if it's perfect to the rules. It's does it work for the situation? We'll look it up later. Uh,
I'm all
the
about that. If it's
yeah,
just a real minor thing, and you're just like, does this do 5d6 or 66 damage? It really doesn't matter that much.
matter. Yeah, like
Like
the
especially
difference
since
between
you're gonna like kill this thing with the 5d6 anyway. Then just
yeah.
whatever. Just give him the extra
Um,
die.
whenever you're put into that situation, my ruling has always been if this instance is going to cause imminent player death, like this character is about to die, then yes, we'll stop the flow of game. We'll crack open the book. We'll look through it. We'll dissect it in its entirety. But if
I had
it's
to do
not
that for
going to
when
be
you
a
almost
huge
died
deal,
last game.
yeah, yeah, like
I had to check. I
that.
actually did have to check how many dice the Ramoraz, because that's how I'm gonna fucking pronounce it, had for a crit, because
Yeah.
I needed to double
Uh,
the dice for its normal attack, and
I have
then
one HP
then I
left.
had to see like which damages were separate, because some of it's fire damage and some of it's like physical damage and shit, and
Yeah.
but like that was important enough because you had 1 HP at the end of that
Hmm.
that I needed to make sure I had my dice in a row.
Yeah, that's a really important moment. And these kinds of things, as a GM, you make that call. But if you're not playing a particularly complicated system like Fifth Edition, and the rules are fairly pliable, where situations come up, if there's somebody on the other side of your table constantly like actually cracking open the book and doing this over and over and over for something like if somebody walks into an inn and I say, okay, it'll be 3 silver pieces for the night, and they crack open the book and says, actually, according to the table here, it says it should only be 1 silver piece, and they got like 150,000 gold.
Yeah, see
Come on, dude.
that's a good line. That's where the nitpickiness needs to stop.
Yeah, and that's usually the line that I draw in the sand. Um, that said, I've encountered players that will just do that constantly. And so I've always put it into my bullet points for character expectations and player expectations, because that's something that has I've encountered a lot, and mainly because a lot of my games involve a lot of new players, and when you have new players, they're trying to learn the rules and they're trying to get used to the system and get used to your DMing style, because not all DMs are created equal. Uh, and because of all of that, there's sometimes a lot of confusion, and a more experienced player, which I will openly offer, if anybody is more experienced in the game than I am, please, if you see a problem with a ruling, just hey, doo -doo,
I mean,
it's
also
actually
if
like
you're
this.
the reason I like having people like that at the table, not like we're not talking about the hyperbole degree, but we're talking about just the average. I know the rules and I want to make sure we're playing right person. Then
Yeah.
it's great to have them at the table, because if you're in the middle of like talking to a player about something that maybe they like saw during their investigation check, and you're like, "Fuck, what's that rule?" You could just turn to whoever that is, just be like, "What's the ruling on X?" And then they say it, and you're like, "All right, cool, we're just gonna do that," and
Yeah.
that's it. You're done, because they already know the rule. And even if you double check later, if they're right, then yeah, all right, cool. Then you have a better understanding of the rules yourself. If they're wrong, then be like, oh shit, maybe this is wrong, but it doesn't really matter that much unless somebody dies, in which case you should have looked up the rules and all that.
Yeah, I am all right with that kind of player being at my table. In fact, I encourage it. Please do that. It's so much easier
You
for
know
us.
what some of this has come down to is have a conversation with your players, and they should be
Yeah.
able to have a conversation with you. So this is one of the reasons why I usually keep my etiquette board not really a bullet point thing like you do, and that's
Hmm.
because I want players to come to me and say what they want the etiquette to also be at the table. Because
Mm.
maybe I'm okay with sexual assault in my games, which in real life I'm not, but let's say I am, and the player isn't. They need to be able to like that. It's not my document that says it's not going to be there, but they need to be able to be like, "Hey, can we stay away from this particular topic?" And
Hmm.
if it's not like the game's based around it, or it's pertinent to the story, then yeah, we'll just drop it. We'll never mention it again. We'll make sure that that's clear for every player.
Yeah.
But if you are playing a game where for some reason that is the central point of the story, then they probably just shouldn't be playing in this game, because that's going to be a
Yeah.
central theme, and they really just need not. If they're not comfortable with it, they just need to stay the hell away.
Hmm. I've run games where like lethality and like Jesse had said in one of our previous episodes, um, where violence and sexualization merge together. Some of those themes can be very uncomfortable for a lot of people. And if you're running a game that's centralized around that kind of thing, like this is a thing you spell out in your handbook and say, these are the things I'm going to add. How do you feel about this? And if it's a central plot, then probably not a good idea. That said, when I write it out, it's usually this is the bare bones
Well,
basics.
yeah, like you said, this isn't a contract for them to sign. Similarly,
Yeah,
you
no.
shouldn't need to put in like all like the loopholes and everything. Just have like generalized, or generalized and specific examples of what's cool and what's not. So with
Oh
the
yeah.
phone example, let's say your GM like wants to have no phones because they've had a big problem in the past and they're just pretty hardcore about this, but you got a special situation going on. Maybe you got kids that you need to make sure you have the phone on just in case something happens, or you're waiting on a call for something important, but not so important that you're taking the time out of your day to play a tabletop game. Um, but maybe you could like come to a compromise. Maybe if the GM says no phones are allowed, maybe it's like you could have your phone on you, just don't be looking at it.
Yeah.
Or if you could have it on the table, but don't like reach over and start tapping around on it. Just like keep the screen up, and if something pops up, you could pay attention to that, but don't go to the internet. Let the internet come to you.
hmm One of the things that I've added in the past as well, it's not in this particular document, but I've had it in for other games, is if your game is taking place in the middle of a Saturday afternoon, it's like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it's likely that some people at some point in time might be expecting a call. So having a ruling that, if you need to take this call, we'll pause game, step outside, make your call, we'll resume.
Yeah, it's easy enough to
Those
say,
kinds of
hey, at two
things are
o'clock,
fine.
I'm expecting like maybe a call for a job interview, like or to set up something like that. And
Yeah.
then like the phone rings at 2, and everybody already knows this is gonna happen. So like everybody's just like, all right, cool, we're gonna put it on pause. Let's take a 5. Let's grab some snacks. Let's do whatever it is while you take care of the phone call. You get done with it,
Yeah.
set the phone down, back in the game.
hmm and being able to make flexible rules like that are always good as a GM. One of the things that I like to add to my packets when I give them to players is also a character planning document. And uh,
I was wondering
this
what you were gonna get at with this.
and the reason why uh, it's not exactly a character etiquette or a player etiquette per se, but one of the things that is really aggravating as a GM is you sit down with a player, they've given you like a 2-3 page backstory, they've written up their character, and that's it. They haven't done any other searching into who this character is. There's a bit of a disconnect with more experienced players and less experienced players. We're like, oh, well, they can do a fireball. Well, where did they learn to do it? And that character planning helps give the players a focus of who their character is, why they are the way they are, personality traits, ideals, a general description, and people that are in their backstory in bullet points, so that if they say, hey, I would like to go and talk to my mom. Oh, okay, well, who's your mom? Or if you present something like that as a knife, which we can go into in another episode, it's basically something that the DM can use against you as a player. Those things help flush out your character's backstory, and they help flush out your character as an entity, who this person is in this game and in this world. And part of that helps focus.
I
And
can't,
that focus,
after listening to that, I'm surprised you let me into any of your games. Because
well,
I don't do this stuff. I come up with like if I come up with a character backstory, it's usually like a page, and then usually at the end is make shit up from here as needed. So I'll like maybe like halfway through the campaign, I've decided, you know what? Maybe this character, this might not have been brought up before, but this character really likes cheap ramen,
yeah.
unironically, for no reason. I don't plan any of that out before I like start playing the game.
And that is the difference between I didn't make you do any of that stuff because I know who you are generally as both a GM and as a player. So I know how you would do things and how you expect to have things done. And you're good at it. This part is for the players that are new that have no idea what they're doing,
All right, we're gonna have to have a
and
whole
I play with a
episode on
lot of them.
this because, like,
Oh
look,
yeah.
I basically I've been in campaigns where the GM sat down at the table and said, "Okay, what are we gonna do?" And then we created the setting, created the characters, and started the game in one session.
Oh yeah.
Like
See, I'm.
to the point where it's just like, what city are we in that's important? And then it's like, you know what? How about we're in like a place called like Farmdale, out in the Midwest,
Uh-huh.
and it's it's known for its cows or some shit like that. It's like, all right, whatever. And then so who's on this farm? And like he's constructing the whole plot in front of our faces because we're also
Yeah.
constructing the plot. So we need to have a whole thing on that.
Oh yeah.
But since there's so much that goes into character planning, let's just stick with the actual people planning.
Fair enough.
So
Yeah.
let's do something specific.
Okay.
Let's talk about side talk, because we basically just had a side
Uh,
conversation about something unrelated to this episode. So now we're back on the episode. Side talk. How do you feel about it?
well,
What's acceptable to
side.
you? Let's use you as a specific example because I want to talk about like me as well. And so what do you do with side talk at your table?
The way I handle side conversations and things like that is, given the fact that I have a 25-page outline of player expectations and this is the world and I'm actually fairly liberal about it
By the way, he's not
because
exaggerating. It's actually 25 pages. I'm looking at it right now.
I'm actually rather liberal about side conversations because a lot of the time, even if it's out of play, uh, it sometimes has the ability to create a really good moment within the game. And as long as they don't get to be too unruly, like these people have been away from the game table talking in a corner for about 45 minutes and be like, hey,
Yeah,
guys,
there's like
come on.
three categories that I know you're thinking of, even if you might not categorize them as such. One of them is volume of what they're doing, because if somebody's
Oh,
shouting
yes.
at each other, that's definitely not acceptable. The
Yeah.
Another category is what's the topic? Is it about the game? Is it about something completely different? Like, are they
Mhm.
discuss? Maybe a player turn to somebody else while you are in the middle of a narration and ask about a specific rule. Like maybe they
Yeah.
asked the guy we mentioned earlier about a rule, and he's just like, "Well, this is what you do to do such and such, etc."
Yeah.
And like that's fine. The topic of conversation. I mean, even if it's not like fully on point, it doesn't really matter much to me. And then the third, what I think is the most important part of this category is how much the players are still paying attention to what's going on around them.
Yes. Yeah, that's where I usually draw the line as well. Is if you can't tell me where your characters are in that moment, generally, then there's probably a disconnect that you have to discuss with your players out of play. But if they can follow along with the general broad strokes and they understand what's going on, but a sidebar conversation about plans for afters or something related to the game or something maybe for next game or something even for a different game and it's like, oh hey, I need to take notes on this because this is really cool. I just came up with an idea. And
Yeah,
it's
I
like,
mean,
oh
you're
really?
hanging out, like you're hanging out with
Yeah.
your friends. You don't have strict conversational guidelines when you go hang out in the living room or whatever with your
Yeah,
roommates.
you're still hanging out with your homies, so sidebar conversations are okay as long as they're kept to a general understanding.
One of
the
my
only
favorite.
time
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
the only time I ever allow shouting for a sidebar conversation in regards to my game is if we're playing in a real space scenario and someone's yelling from the kitchen, "Who wants nachos?"
You know
That's cool.
that's actually that's a really good example to bring up. Like literally yelling in as your character. I don't accept that in at my table. If you are going to literally scream, you could say my character screams, and then you say what you're saying, in a raised voice. You don't have to be like, "Hey, my
Yeah.
character's just yelling right now." But if you're screaming at the same tone as your character is in play, that's not good for me. That immediately makes my ears hurt, and it pisses me off straight up. But So that's a good rule to have. Like, or if you, if at your table you want this to happen, if you want people to get so into their character that they are yelling at each other from across the room and making loud accusations at each other, then that's fine for your table. Just make sure that's
Yeah.
clear to everybody.
Yep. And my thing with that is I've had characters and even characters as myself who, uh, as their character, break down in a very intense emotional moment, and they're experiencing it as their player for a kind of method acting role, and they're just sitting there, real tears are crying. They're trying to make sense of what's happening, and that emotional moment, I have always encouraged players to do that. Some GMs cannot do it because it can be too much, and either way is perfectly fine. But spelling that out in the beginning of your game is really important. I encourage my players rather, to act as much like their character as they can. If their character screams and this person lets out a blood-curdling scream and starts crying, I'm all right with that because they're getting into the character. On the other token, that's not a thing that I do with certain GMs because every GM is very different. And the acting thing, where my characters are concerned, is very muted depending on the campaign. So that's actually a place where you and I differ, Nick.
And oh, as I was about to say, as a player, what you could do is actually just straight up ask the GM what the expectations are,
Oh
because
yeah,
if you're not sure, you're coming to a table you've never sat at before, then like if the GM both encourages like this amount of yelling, then and you want to do this amount of yelling, then it sounds like that's a perfect fit.
oh yeah. Um,
So one of
Now,
the things that I wanted to, I was going to mention a bit earlier is something that's kind of a sidebar but still in play. I wanted to use Shadowrun as an example. Now I can't
ooh,
properly reflect this because this is an auditory medium and not a visual one. But something that we would do in this game was a little hand sign. Basically, all you do is extend your thumb and your pinky finger. Now point your thumb towards yourself and your pinky finger towards whoever you're talking to. That means you're talking to them via comlink. So that way, anybody else who's looking at you knows that you're either texting whoever this is or you're speaking directly either through subvocal microphones or whatever. So they don't know what you are saying, but this is a very clear hand sign that anybody could just glance over at and be like, oh, yeah, this isn't something I can listen to.
this doesn't
Um,
involve me.
and I wanted to bring that up because that is kind of a sidebar thing. People would do that when they needed to talk to another character and play, but it didn't generally involve me as the GM. And usually at the time, because it's Shadowrun and everybody splits up all the time, I was trying to run like probably like 3 or 4 scenarios at the same time.
Oh
So
yeah.
not having to focus on whatever they're doing over there, it was great because all I had to do even was glance over, see that they were doing something through a comm link, and then I got to go back to doing what I was doing. And when it became relevant, I could just straight up ask them, like, "What did you guys talk about? Just give me like the cliff notes." And they'd just
Yeah.
be like, we were just talking about like sending some new yen through the wire because he wanted to pay for like this item that I got or whatever." I'm like, cool, sweet, you do that, you're done, and
Yeah.
then it's back to the game.
Another hand signal, I actually picked this up from a LARP that I used to play some years ago, is if you are intending to speak out of character, you just take your hand, ball it up into a fist, and place your thumb and forefinger, fist side basically upside down on the top of your head, and that signals to everyone else that you are making an out of place statement.
Yeah, most
And
LARPs have something along those lines.
yeah,
It's always like something on your head because that's not usually like a weird fist shape you make on the top of your head is not something you would normally do. So when somebody sees it, it's usually not like an accidental hand sign.
yeah. And because of that, you can make rulings based on what the players are saying, and it prevents you from having to go, oh, no, 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 that was totally out of play. I didn't mean to actually say that to the, I didn't mean to say this guy's a pompous prick right to the prince's face.
Yeah,
I meant to
that
communicate that out of play to my buddy here, who I think is also finding this situation completely hilarious. You know,
yeah
it
that's
helps.
a good point you've got there because I know I've had this problem several times and
For hell, I've done it.
and yeah, this is why I started giving people fuck up counters because
Yeah.
Basically, a fuck-up counter is some kind of thing that you could give the player that they have access to, like, one of them a game, like a session, and it does refresh at the beginning of each session. But it's basically did something in play, or I wasn't clear that this was out of play, thus it was in play, and I would like to not I would not like to not
Like,
call the king an asshole to his face since I'm
yeah.
in the middle of his court. And then you hand me the fuck up counter, and then it's like, all right, so that doesn't happen, and then you continue on with what you do. If you do that again and you don't have a fuck up counter, then whatever it was and it wasn't clear out of play, and it's like you just call him a fucking idiot to his face.
Well, there you go.
Well, you got to deal with that now.
Yeah. Making sure that you have rules like that in place before your game starts is really important. I have evolved a lot, both as a player and a GM. The last time I played in a campaign that was in person with Nick, I needed more fuck up counters than he was willing to give me,
Mm-hmm.
simply because I just didn't have the experience as a player, as particularly for the system,
See, I
that I
also
needed.
I would also say give a lot of leeway to like new players. The fuck up counter thing I only deploy for people who either I can never tell when they're talking like in or out of play, which is why I like even slight accents or tone pitches as your character.
Oh yeah,
I always recommend those because even if you just drop your voice down an octave or something, then you're able to know that you're speaking in character versus just your regular speaking voice.
yeah. Um, so having things like that in place is really really important. Um, Something that I have had some trouble with, as a GM, is hogging the spotlight. And it's really easy to do as a GM
It's also easy to
where,
do as a player,
oh yeah.
and we're going to talk about
Um,
both sides of this.
so you'll get into your NPCs, and you've created this entire beautiful, elaborate world that your players are running through, and you're really proud of the NPCs. They're really well fleshed out. You like their accents. You like the story that molded them into
Yeah,
the
you're
bastard that
very
they are
happy with
today.
what you've created and are excited to get into it.
And sometimes a GM can uh, go a little too overboard and take all of the spotlight away from the players to accent their perfect villain and the fact that they know better than everyone else. It's like, no, he's still talking. You can't interrupt him. He's entirely too boisterous and better than you to ever be. I said he's not being interrupted,
Oh,
young man.
dude, Jesse would find a way to interrupt this guy somehow or another. I
Oh
actually have
yeah,
to
he would.
find ways to counter the interruption so I can actually get a monologue out.
Like
But
it
yeah,
shoots
you're
you in the chest.
what? What?
Jesse tried to shoot one of your characters monologuing in the chest. He was like,
Yeah,
"No,
he
it's
tried
not
doing that.
happening."
I had to. Made sure that this villain had a PA system rigged in play, so that way, when she started talking to him, he couldn't immediately shoot her or shut her up. And I still didn't get like through the whole monologue before he rolled into the room and started blasting.
Yep, that's the thing that happened. Um,
But if
so
basically
yeah,
if you don't suck all of like the interactivity away from your players, like
yeah,
don't control the player like the player characters at all because that's you even intentionally or unintentionally hogging the spotlight in some way or another.
mhm,
You want to have enough breaks in what you're saying and what you're describing so that way it's a little more clear that the players can interact with whatever's going on because not
mhm.
everybody's comfortable interrupting a GM, and as a GM I don't like always being interrupted, much like my villains, except they don't really get a choice. They get shot at. I get a choice because I'm playing God, and
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that whoever like if a player is at your table, and this is way easier to do in person, but you could see it on their face when they're like they like maybe their eyebrows are raised up, their face is like more bright or is brightened, and you could tell they're trying to say something, they want to do something, but you just keep narrating.
Mhm.
Then that's gonna kill some of the fun.
Yeah. I am actually very guilty of doing something that some of my players affectionately, but also irritatedly, refer to as Stephen Kinging, which is basically explaining everything in the most minute of details and how it affects everything, including Pluto. Because of that, I am taking time away from the players to interact with this scene and this scenario by simply expressing what the scenario and the scene is, and being able to juggle whether or not this particular detail is important or not. It's a balancing act, even for me. So being aware you have a tendency to overtalk like that is very important.
See, I
Something you
have
need
a
to be aware
Xander.
of.
I actually have a weird problem. It's the opposite of that. Sometimes I don't talk enough when it comes to describing the mundane things, and I'm trying to get better at that because, well, the way I like to play games and the way people like to play games seem to be very different. Because
Hmm.
if a GM just describes the scene, like I'm gonna go nuts with like if I have questions, I'm gonna do it. If a GM describes a dresser that's in the room, and like they don't mention anything about it, they don't like describe how it looks. It's just there's a dresser, there's a chair, like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I have like a goal in mind, like we're investigating something. I'm not gonna just be like, I want to roll investigation. I'm gonna be like, I'm gonna go over to that dresser and I'm gonna start pulling out drawers and I'm gonna describe in detail what I'm doing because that's more fun for me.
Yeah.
And since you've left the dresser design kind of a blank template, as a player, I like being able to put my own details into the game because
Hmm.
naturally I just like GMing more. So maybe this dresser that the GM didn't describe at all, maybe it's like, I don't know, a black charred, piece of furniture that was pulled from like the wreckage of like a family house or something that burned down. And it's like the GM didn't need to come up with that. Hell, I didn't really even need to come up with that. But it was cool and it was in the game. And a lot of the people that I run games for, they want that presented to them already instead of wanting to make things up. And sometimes
Yeah.
I forget that because I like making shit up. And the GM I usually play under, he also likes it when players make shit up. So it's like a perfect, symbiosis there. But it
Yeah.
doesn't jive so well when your players want you to have the Xander experience, the Stephen King experience, where you describe everything, and then that helps them out. So
Yeah.
just
Like,
find what you want to do, and find a balance between what you want to do and what your players want to do, and go from there.
yeah. The way you can break it down as a GM, for your players, whether they want to add or not. Like Nick likes to add, some players don't like to add. Um, I always go with something like it's called the rule of three. Is any three given senses, sight being required, is evoked by this space. Say you walk down a set of stairs. The stairs are made of a hard gray stone. At the bottom of the stairs is a wooden door that feels a bit rough to the touch, and you can smell a bit of the mold, and it's just old. You press it open, and uh, the casters give a bit of a creak as they haven't been moved in a long time, and you open up into the space. It's about 20 foot by 10 foot. It's a fairly standard sized room. You see a large 4-poster bed with the covers all strewn about haphazardly, like a person left in a bit of a hurry. To the right hand side, you see a large armoire. One of the doors still hanging open, and a bit of cloth folding down out as if they grabbed their things and moved quickly. Everything seems to be in its proper place, but there's a couple of things that don't seem to be where they should be, as a lamp has fallen over onto the bed. Luckily, it was not
Xander,
lit.
that is a perfect example that differentiates the way we run games, right
Hmm.
there, and the way we play games. See, don't give us like a whole backstory, but on a scale from 1 to 10, how important is this room you just described in this theoretical? And you can make it whatever you want.
This is just the entryway to a bedroom in a castle that they're investigating because they wanted to.
Okay, So this
It's
room's
not
not very
particularly
important.
important.
See,
No.
when it comes to that kind of thing, if it's not an important room, I kind of leave out some details because we don't need. I don't need the players getting bogged down and distracted by a bunch of different stuff. Now,
Hmm.
I would describe a room in that great of a detail if it were an important room. But and this is kind of the problem I was alluding to a little bit earlier about how I undertell stuff. I leave out all of the parts about like how it seems like whoever was in here left in a hurry because as a player, if you presented everything without the explanation, I would start asking questions. I would be like, "Is there any furniture that's out of place?" And then maybe whoever's running this would say something akin to, "Yeah, the armoire you can actually see. There's an indentation where there isn't dust because it was moved
Uh,
recently." And then I'll be like, "How recently?" And if there was an answer, then or if I couldn't tell, then I'd be like, "Is there anything else that seems like it was going on like this?" And then that's when you would get more of the background why details.
yeah.
Um, but until somebody asks those questions, I generally leave out the why this takes place because I like piecing together that kind of stuff. Maybe your players don't like piecing stuff together as much as I do. But if you
I've had
give
a
me a
lot of
fucking juicy
players.
puzzle and give me minimal like details on it, I'm gonna still figure out if I can solve that fucking puzzle.
Yeah. My issue that I have is that unimportant room was vacated recently by a servant who had been, uh, let go from his job, and he had to gather his things quickly. It's not important to the story at all, but I know who is in every single room, why they were in there, what happened to them, if they're still there or not, and I present those things in such a way because if I walk into a room, a cursory glance would tell me, all right, this looks like somebody got out of here in a fucking hurry. There's shit just thrown all over the place. What the hell? It's one of those
Yeah, I
things
mean,
that,
this is a much more gray area because I might argue
yeah,
that maybe you wouldn't be able to decipher that upon entering a room. Maybe you could see the disheveled state of it, but not why it's disheveled. Maybe although you described the servant having to leave very quickly, maybe for what actually happened was there was a fight that was in here, and there was a lot of the
ooh,
scuffle like pushed stuff over and made it seem like somebody had to get out of here in a hurry, which somebody did, and that was the person who beat the shit out of the other person who needed to leave before the cops showed up, and not a
yeah,
servant at all. That's kind of why we're getting into this gray area here because
yeah,
like even that one scenario, and this is also kind of why I like leaving out certain details because I want my players to make assumptions. I want them to form theories. I want them to plan. And I do make that clear whenever I run games. You don't come to my table to have a crunchy dungeon crawl. You come to my table so you can put pieces of puzzles together, both in plot, literal sense, and in figurative sense, and solve like the story. So
hmm,
because the reason why I like doing this and the reason why I like doing this as a player is because when I solve whatever it is, like if a GM's presented a problem that they've left out a lot of details, but I solve it and I'm right, then that's an amazing feeling to me.
oh, it
It's like when
is,
I
it
solved
really
that
is.
puzzle that you presented. I still
Hmm.
love talking about that because you said like two details and I solved the puzzle
Yeah,
that nobody else could solve, and it was so satisfying. And that might not be the case for everybody, because maybe not everybody likes solving puzzles as much as I do. But that's definitely something I like, and it's what I look for in a game.
my current players aren't big on political intrigue or puzzle solving bits. They are more about engaging in the story in more personal ways. So I've gotten into the habit of Stephen Kinging it, which is kind of a bad thing. I'll openly admit it. I need to kind of tone it back a little bit, but that's just an example of one of my faults as a GM, and knowing those faults can help keep you as a GM, like I do from time to time, from stealing the spotlight for your characters. And that's a perfect example. Nick likes to figure out the story. And if the story is already presented to him, it's like, oh well, that was kind of a
Well,
letdown.
because I already know the story. Like, it might be very interesting to hear about, sure, but if it's something related directly to the plot and it was put in, I kind of wonder why it was put in if there was no real interaction with it, because it is a game after all. You're not reading a novel. You're not reading
Yeah.
Stephen King. But just like it's important to keep an eye out for if you're doing that as a GM, you also got to keep an eye out for if you're doing that as a player. It's
Hmm.
much it's much easier to tell if you're a player because you're generally just not speaking and narrating as much as the GM. But if if somebody is presented with a problem, like maybe a lock that needs to be picked for a very simple example, that's clearly meant to go to the rogue. That lets them do a thing. That lets them maybe there's something more complex with this lock that lets them role play it out a little bit. Maybe there's an NPC that's related. It doesn't really matter what the details are. But if you're playing the warlock and you're just all up in this lock's business, and it's very clearly for the rogue, and they don't even get to like interact with it. Maybe the rogue player is pretty shy. Maybe they're kind of introverted, and they kind of have to wait for the GM to toss like specific throws at them in order to really get into the character. If you keep interrupting this player, or try to do your own things, then you've relegated their character as a pointless object that's hanging out in the scene. And to some extent, that's kind of like relegating the person that's playing the character as a pointless object that's sitting in the scene at your game table.
Yeah. Um, a As a player, the delegation of who is in the spotlight should generally come from your GM. Now, there are moments where, as a player, that you need to seek the spotlight. A great example is my character in Nick's game. Is a politician. When they go to a new city, my character's goal is to go and speak with whomever is in charge because he wants to get a feel for the climate. He wants to get a feel for, where he fits in the pecking order of this particular society. And he wants to understand why the things in this town are happening the way they are from the top. Whereas another character says, you know, I want to see what the criminal underbelly of this city's got to offer. There might be some good pickpocketing locations, really get into it. And, you know,
Yeah.
those two places are vastly different. And both of these characters can and do exist within a certain game scenario.
And they might there's something that I think you're leaving out, and it's that both of these characters can exist in the same scene.
Oh,
And
yes.
the trick is to make sure that when you're in the seedy underbelly and it's not your character's basically turn to figure out what the hell's going on, let the rogue do that. Like that's
Yeah.
why they came down here to talk to the criminals and like rob people or whatever. And
Yeah.
you don't need to be doing that as your politician. Similarly, the rogue doesn't need to be pissing off whoever the royalty is when you're speaking to whoever's in charge of a city or a country.
Yep. And when you get two players that are very open about the fact that they want to handle some certain stuff. There's been instances where my character, as the politician, is talking to these seedy underbelly types, trying to negotiate some kind of a deal. But then there's, on the flip side, the seedy. We're going to go ahead and call him a rogue, even though he wasn't a rogue. Uh, Character of Jesse's, who was Tarash Porter, dealing with some of the higher ups, and clearly we're not supposed to be crossing, but that comes from knowing the other players at the table, and that also comes from how comfortable you are with your GM, the other players, the other characters as your character. But the golden rule is that if your GM says, okay, we're going to move from your scene to this scene, you can't be like, hey, I wasn't done yet. And that kind of overt stealing of the GM's relegated time for each of these characters doing their thing is really disrespectful to the other players, and it's also disrespectful to your GM. So being aware that you're given a certain amount of time for your spotlight, that's your time to shine. Adversely so, if you don't take advantage of that spotlight, that's more on you as a player. And that goes a whole into knowing how your character operates, knowing when to take your turn to speak, even in disorganized play.
Even when the spotlight is cast on the entire party at the same time. I wanted to get into that example when everyone is
Ooh.
relevant all of a sudden. It's
Oh
still
yeah.
important. So you'll see this most commonly played out as somebody at the table keeps doing stuff. They'll say whatever their character's doing. They'll add stuff to it. They'll keep going and going and going and going, and nobody else will be able to. You won't really even notice that nobody else has done anything until somebody's like, "I need to do this," and it's something that happened at the very beginning of all that shit that the previous player just described. So
Oh yeah.
when you're in a scene that has a big spotlight for everybody, then like definitely play your part. Definitely get into it as like your character would. But if somebody else is trying to get a word in edgewise, let them get the whole sentence in. And so this is something more of a gameplay mechanic thing, but it's
Hmm.
something that people generally don't do, and because it feels bad to do it, frankly. So let's assist rolls.
Ooh.
Commonly in games, you will see that one person acts as the primary for the roll. They roll whatever their skill is, and then whatever the assistants are, they will roll and either add bonuses or successes, whatever the mechanics are for it. Um, so for D&D, it's somebody assists, you get advantage. So it much easier to do in this in something like D&D. But if you're the reason why I'm bringing this up is if the spotlight's on you, you should be the primary for whatever the skill check is. You've just spent the last 5 to 10 actual minutes role playing with I don't know, some kind of politician. We'll just go with that, and you're trying to convince them to enact a certain policy. And now all of a sudden, your guy who is actually spec'd in charisma wants to roll the primary dice. As a player, I make sure that whoever's the primary is the primary. As a GM, if I see that happening, then I'll be like, you get to roll assist, Mister +5 charisma, because they're the one who did all the talking.
Hmm.
So you roll it, and I the reason nobody likes this and why nobody does it is because the number isn't big enough. In this example, the example that we're seeing in a lot of games, the person who should be the primary roller maybe has a +1, we'll say, for whatever this is. But you want to have the person who has the +5 or more to actually roll it because it makes the number bigger and thus increase the chance of success, etc., etc., etc. I
Hmm.
would try to not do that. Uh, just because narratively it doesn't make sense. If somebody just comes in at the very end and says that's right, like the +5 for charisma doesn't mean anything. Like
No.
he doesn't matter. But that was a real side, off topic thing for the most part. But that's more like if it does come back to etiquette actually. If the
Hmm.
player who is the
Hmm.
primary wants to be the primary, then don't make them feel bad for like rolling a die that has a minus to it just because they wanted to try something.
Yeah. And as a player, your etiquette isn't just regarding the DM, the DM's house, or if you're in another location. It also regards to the other players. If there's a player in your game that he's the rogue, his charisma is a +1, and he walks into the scene with his chest puffed out, and he's trying to delegate and figure out what's going on, but you're the character that should be doing this. Don't be afraid to take a step forward and add your character's 2 cents in. Taking that moment to also include your character in something that they should be doing in the first place helps to combat some of that spotlight stealing, and helps to like in this example, if you have something to say and you can say it eloquently as your character, both roles should be respected, and it's not necessarily who initiated the conversation or initiated the scene.
It could be two
It's
separate roles.
Yeah, it could
Like
be
it,
two
like
separate
in that
roles.
Shadowrun example, not that Shadowrun example, but the one where you were in space and after Zenshin made a really rousing speech to all the troops, it was its own roll. Then you came in behind him and, put a real
We're all gonna
damper on
die.
everyone's mood. So when you
Uh,
rolled, it was like, it's your own roll, but everyone's mood's just kind of like, maybe we're not ready for this fight.
yeah, this is like we're all gonna die. You have to accept the fact that we're all gonna die, and if you don't accept that, you're going to be met with a lot more resistance than you thought you had. You have to be realistic about this situation. So if you got a chance to do something like that, um, I would say go ahead and do it because that scene is going to be
Yeah.
talked
I
about
mean,
for
it's
years
going
to
to be
come,
awesome. I mean,
and
just
it might change some
it's pretty
things.
much just the golden rule, except to just replace some words with gaming. It's like, play the game the way you would want players to play your game.
Oh
And
yes, yes.
and if common courtesy isn't so common at your table, maybe you could use some of the ideas this podcast had to offer to help pave the way for more civil play. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you next time on Playing God.
Later, man.
Bye for now.